I know it says fascinating design in the human body, but that's not what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is just design in general, and is design good evidence for creation? Because, a lot of times the evolutionist says, oh, you creationists, y'all are always talking against evolution. What about some positive evidence? Don't you have any positive evidence for creation? And the thing I always like to ask them is this: what evidence are you willing to accept? I mean, if you don't know what you're willing to accept, how would you know? All the way back in the early 1800s, there was a gentleman by the name of William Paley. He was a liberal theologian, but he proposed something that I think is a good starting point about how to recognize creation. He said this. He said, if you were walking in the forest and you found a watch, would you think that over hundreds of years, pieces of glass, metal, and gears, along with ink in the shape of numbers, had come together to form a watch? Or would you think that there was an intelligent creator responsible for that watch? And even though that sounds like a simple argument, you know what? I think that's still one of the best arguments for looking for creation. I think that's one of the best evidences for creation, is whether or not there's an intelligent creator. And there's different areas that we can go and look to see whether or not there is any evidence of a creator, of an intelligent creator. But you know what's the best place to look, I think, is right there in the field of living things. Because when we look at life, when we look at things that are alive, we're looking at things that come about in such a way that even we can't duplicate it. We don't go in a laboratory and duplicate life. We're looking at something that's even beyond man's intellectual capacity. We're looking at something that even man has not been able to duplicate. In fact, as a medical physician, I'll go out on a limb and I'll say this. As a physician, we don't even fix life. Now, it's bad enough that we don't create it. We can't make it. There had to be somebody more intelligent than me who created it, but I don't even fix it. All I do is help your own body fix itself. That's an interesting thought. So that if I was looking for evidence of an intelligent creator, it would have to be out there in the living world. It would have to be somebody that can do what I can't do. And that's where I think the best evidence to look for a creator would exist. Well, what type of evidence would you expect to find if there is a creator? Is it just a matter of faith, or can you go out there and look for specific cases of evidence in order to see what type of evidence that you would look for? What would you consider to be evidence? And there's two things that we're going to, or two different answers. We've either going to have time, chance, and natural processes, or we're going to have plan, purpose, and design. Now, let me show you an example of something, and you see if you can figure it out. Time, chance, and natural processes, or plan, purpose, and design. And let me just say this. Everybody knows what time, chance, and natural processes are, but plan, purpose, and design, let me kind of take that up a little bit. A plan is when you put information into a system. It's the information that a system follows. The purpose is that that information is being used in a certain way, or using information in a certain way. And when both the plan and the purpose act together, then you have a design. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for information. We're looking for that information being used to accomplish something, and we're looking for the plan and the purpose acting together to form a design. Now, look at this example, and you tell me, is this plan, purpose, and design, or time, natural processes, and random chance? You find a big long tube of aluminum with aluminum wings sticking out the side. Now, is that evidence of time, chance, and natural processes, or is that evidence of plan, purpose, and design? What do you think? That's plan, purpose, and design. It's easy to tell. Number one, if you find aluminum in this form, you know it's not natural processes, because aluminum never exists naturally in the metal form. It always exists as bauxite, as corrosive aluminum. In fact, I worked at Kaiser Aluminum Reduction Plant down in Chalmette, right where the Battle of New Orleans was fought. And I worked there one summer. It was 160 degrees in the pot rooms. We used to produce molten aluminum by electrochemical reduction. And I'll never forget, after the first day I worked in there, I came home and I was dead. And I looked at my dad and I said, "Dad, I want to go to college." So that's what, that helped me continue my medical career. But number one, natural processes could never account for metallic aluminum. What about long periods of time? What if I just let that corroded aluminum sit for a long period of time? Over a period of time, would oxidized aluminum turn into metal aluminum? No. you'd get more and more oxidized aluminum. So time is not the hero of the plot, as George Wald says, it's the enemy. And finally, random chance would just spread that aluminum all over the place. When you see a system that's highly organized with information set up to accomplish a particular goal, just like that aluminum airplane is, then you think of plan, purpose, and design. Whenever you see plan, purpose, and design, you know something else, that the design does not occur by the natural processes acting over a period of time by random chance. Rather, the design in getting those wings in just the right area, in shaping that aluminum in the tube, is imposed from the outside. Remember that. Design is not in the aluminum. Design comes from the outside. You could ask it like this. Well, do you think that aluminum flies? Can aluminum fly? No. If you pulled the wings off, they wouldn't fly. Pull the engines off, they wouldn't fly. Pull the little people out the cockpit, they don't fly. It's that design that's imposed from the outside that makes that whole structure fly. That's evidence of plan, purpose, and design. Give you another example. You find little pieces of colored rocks. You find them just distributed. What do you think? Time, natural processes, or plan, purpose, and design? Could be time, natural processes, and random chance. But take the same pieces of colored rock. What do you think now? You see the difference? Evidence for design is seen when you take these naturally occurring things and you impose a design. That design always comes from the outside. Always remember that design is not a evidence of natural processes acting over a long period of time. And design is imposed from the outside. Now, we said we were going to look for design, for evidence of an intelligent designer, an intelligent creator, that we would look for that out in the biological world, in the world of living things. And there's really 4 areas that we'd like to look at it for. We'd like to look at it in molecular biology, or the origin of life, and I just spoke real briefly about that. No, I spoke in depth about it, so I'm not going to do too much on it. We'd find it in the area of homology. I was at a little church in Mississippi, and I said, we're going to look for evidence in homology, and a man jumped up in the back row. He said, wait a minute, I don't want to talk about them people in San Francisco at all. Homology doesn't deal with that. It deals with look-alike organisms. Harmony, or the fits-like-a-glove phenomenon, I call this engineering. We're going to look for evidence of engineering, because if we find good engineering, intelligent engineering in the living world, that tells me that there must be an intelligent engineer. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about natural selection and see that it actually indicates design. All right, let's start out with molecular biology, the origin of life. When we start talking about molecular biology, what we're talking about are the chemicals that make up life. Now, when we look at those chemicals and their different reactions, we're mainly looking at 2 different types of chemicals. We're looking at DNA, which is the molecule of heredity. That's the thing that makes you what you are. And we're looking at proteins. These are the molecules of form and function. These are the things that build things in your body. These are the things that do things in your body. DNA is the blueprint. And when we look at DNA, the molecule of heredity, what we find are long chains of 3 different chemicals that are hooked together. You've got a sugar hooked to a phosphate, hooked to a sugar, hooked to a phosphate. That's this long chain right here. But you see these little guys that are coming off your sugar? Those are the bases. Bases come in 4 different varieties. And depending upon which of the 4 bases are in which particular sequence, you get a different code, a different sentence, if you will. You see, the human body, the DNA, uses those 4 different chemicals just like we use the different letters in the alphabet. Or if you want to look at it like Morse code uses 3 different symbols, dot, dash, and space. DNA uses 4 different bases to do the same thing and to spell out certain functions. Think of it like a long chain with the letters sticking out the end. And these 4 different letters spell out all the information that you need to make a human being. Do you realize that you started out as one complementary strand of DNA in a cell, resulting from the combination of different bases from your mom and your dad, and that from that one single DNA in that cell, over a 9-month period, you produced all the cells, all the different cells in your body that you had when you were born. And from that one DNA, that original DNA, every cell got a copy of that DNA. Now this is the amazing thing. From that one DNA in that cell, you were able not just to make skin cells, but liver cells, heart cells, stomach cells. From that one DNA, you were able to make every different type of cell in your body. Some people have estimated that there are over 100 trillion cells in the human body. So that from starting with that very simple level, you were able to make all the cells that you have now, and all the different cells, and not just all the different cells, but all the different cells in the right order, in the right position, in the right place. Most people don't walk around with their heart growing out their ear. You were able to get all that information correct. In fact, it's been estimated that you have so much information in that DNA molecule because of that sequence, because you can actually write a book with this code. You've got enough information to fill 1,000 volumes, 500 pages each, with the smallest readable print possible. That's a tremendous amount of information. And it's all the information that you need to make a person. That's what the DNA does. It's the blueprint. It would be the same thing as if you were building a house and you started with just a blueprint. This is what the DNA is. That's how it started. And this is what it's produced. That's a tremendous amount of information. But the secret to the DNA lies in the code, in the genetic code. Now, what the DNA does, the other molecule rather, that we talked about, was proteins. Proteins are made up of amino acids. Just one type of chemical. Remember, the DNA has 3 different types, but the main one is the base. Proteins are like a string of pearls, and each pearl is one of a different type of amino acid. We use 20 different amino acids. Now, all the different amino acids line up in a different order. Just like in the alphabet, there are 26 different letters. Depending upon which letter we put in what order and where we put a space, we can make different sentences. And it's the same thing with the amino acids. Depending on how we line up these different amino acids, we make different proteins. And there's different proteins that build different things and that do different things. Hemoglobin is the protein that carries oxygen. Lysozyme is the protein that eats up bacteria. Insulin makes you less sweet, and glucagon makes you more sweet. And there's a whole bunch of different proteins that do different things in the body. But the reason that those proteins do different things, the way that they know what to do, is because of the order that they're in. Because of the order of the different 20 amino acids and how many of them you stuck together. Some are big, some are small. Well, what's the relationship of DNA to protein? Just real quick, DNA makes protein. It uses RNA to kind of fix the amino acids in the right place to make the protein. The code in the DNA is translated into a certain order of amino acids, so that that DNA contains the information that you need to make every single protein in your body. It's not real complicated. It's just that the DNA is the main information storage area. That main information storage area is translated, and it makes proteins that actually do the work. If you want to look at it like this, DNA is the foreman and protein are the workers. Here's the question. Can you get DNA and protein just from natural processes acting over a long period of time by random chance? Or does DNA and protein show plan, purpose, and design? And the answer is very simple. We had spoken about this the last hour. When you look at the experiments that have been done in trying to get amino acids and different bases and sugars and phosphates to come together, you look at something like the Miller-Urey experiment. And that Miller-Urey experiment, I have a better picture of it here. The Miller-Urey experiment combined some chemicals together to see if those chemicals would naturally come together and line up in an order to make a complicated information system. Did they? The answer is absolutely not. Number one, natural processes produce the wrong types of chemical reactions, reacting in the wrong place, all of them falling apart in the wrong amounts. So that if you just allow it to the natural chemical processes, the laws of chemistry and physics will never give you the amino acids that you need. They'll never give you the right amount of amino acids that you need. They'll never give you the bases. They'll never give you DNA and protein. So natural processes never can produce the proteins that we're looking at. What about over a long period of time? What if we just let those things react over long periods of time? It gets worse. You see, what's happening are destructive reactions. And if you let destructive reactions continue over a long period of time, they just destroy more. Think of it this way. Take a 3-year-old to a glass store, a store that sells china. Give him a hammer and let him loose for 10 seconds. And then let him loose for an hour. Would you get more china or less china? You see? And it's the same exact thing here. You've got to look at the time as being the enemy, not the hero of the plot. What about by random chance? You never get coded information by random chance. And I keep saying this over and over again, and it's true, because this is the best analogy. When you see a book, this book was not printed by taking a hand grenade, putting it in a vat of ink, and surrounding it with paper. When you print a book, in order to get the letters in the right order, you have to have intelligence and information to step in and put those letters in the right sequence. You have to have them act in the right order to put them in the right order. Whenever you find an information system, a code, like we find in DNA, like we find in proteins, it must have an information source. And the science of information theory tells me this. I can never get information from non-information. I can never spontaneously just increase the amount of information in a system. I can transfer it from one place to the other, but I don't create new information. I can transfer it, but it just doesn't spring from nothing. The chemicals that go into these origin of life experiments have no information. The arrangement of amino acids that I find in the human body and in all living things have a tremendous amount of information. And the science of information theory just will not that allow to come from natural processes acting over a long period of time by random chance. Now, life itself just does not occur if you mix proteins and amino acids together. Some people have said, well, what if we took proteins and mixed them together? Do you think we could get life? Well, they've tried that, and they don't. If you just took proteins and mixed them together, you won't get life, and there's a reason. You see, you must have proteins to maintain life, but you need DNA to make those proteins. But you got to have proteins to make the DNA. You can't get DNA without proteins, and you can't get proteins without DNA. Or you can't get the DNA to work without the proteins. So proteins require DNA, but DNA requires the proteins first, which requires the DNA first. It's a typical catch-22. What came first, the chicken or the egg? There's no way to get proteins without DNA, and no way to get DNA to work without proteins. So if you just mix proteins and DNA together, you're not going to get life, and these origin of life experiments will never produce the type of information, the type of chemicals in the right arrangement that produce life. When we look at molecular biology, when we look at origin of life studies, when we look at the information, there's the key word, information. When we look at the information in living systems, what I find is evidence that there was an intelligent information source right at the beginning to hook those molecules, to hook those chemicals in the right order. If there wasn't an intelligent information source, then all I had was natural processes acting over a long period of time by random chance, and all I get from that is a mess. I'll never get information, molecules like DNA, like protein. There has to be an intelligent creator when I look at the DNA and the protein molecules in living systems. What about homology? What is homology itself? Homology is used as evidence of either a common ancestor or a designer. And when we look at homology, what we're looking at is this. If we look at the arm of different creatures, if we look at the arm of a bat, we find that a bat has one large bone in the upper arm, a large and a small bone in the lower arm, and 5 digits. If we look at a bird, large upper bone, 2 bones in the lower arm or the forearm, 5 digits. Man, large upper bone, 2 bones in the lower arm, 5 digits. Porpoise, the same thing. Now the evolutionist looks at that and says, look at that, that's perfect evidence of a common ancestor, of evolution. That all of us, all of these creatures evolved from some type of animal that had this exact same pattern. Now, that's what they believe if there's a common ancestor. And you know what? That's true. A brother looks more like his sister than he does his cousin. So that when you look at homology, it could be evidence, I'm not saying that it is, but it could be evidence for a common ancestor. But you know what else it could be evidence of? It could be evidence of a common design, right? Look at these automobiles. Do you think one automobile evolved from the other? Or do you think they had a common design? So you see, we've got two equally good explanations. Which one is true? Well, Sir Alister Hardy said that the concept of homology is absolutely fundamental to what we are talking about when we speak of evolution. Yet, in truth, we cannot explain it at all in terms of present-day biological theory. Sir Alister Hardy said that homology doesn't fit with present biological theory, and yet evolution requires it. Sir Gavin de Beer, when he started looking at homology, started asking some embarrassing questions about homology. He said, you know, it's true that all the arms of different animals look alike, but you don't have to go to a different animal. Your arm contains one large bone in the upper arm, two bones in the lower arm, and 5 digits. But what about your leg? Did you know that your leg contains one large bone in the upper leg, 2 bones in the lower leg, and 5 digits? And what Sir Gavin de Beer asked is this: did arms evolve from legs, or did legs evolve from arms? Now, this is a man who's an expert in this area, and he wrote a very critical paper. In fact, he started looking at it, and he said, wait a minute, homology ought to carry all the way through. Did men evolve from women? Did people evolve from creatures with only one sex? And does that mean that we're sexier than bacteria? He said, where do you stop with this homology thing? He said homology should carry all the way through the biological world. But you know, Sir Gavin de Beer's expertise is in the area of embryonic homology. And he started looking at all of these different parts. They call them homologous parts. That just means this type of thing, homologous look-alike parts. And he asked this question: do those look-alike homologous body parts all develop at the same time with similar cells in the same area in all the different types of embryo? If I look at the arm of a man, does it develop at the same time by the same cells in the same area of the human embryo as the porpoise arm develops, as the fish arm, as the bat's arm develops? Do all those homologous look-alike body parts develop with the same cells in the embryo at the same place in the same time from the same cells? Because if evolution is true, that's exactly what you would expect, because you're saying that they all have a common ancestor, they all have a common origin, and they should share a common embryonic homology. Guess what Sir Gavin de Beer found? The answer is absolutely not. In fact, Michael Denton, in his book, Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, and much of what I'm talking about comes from there, said that organs and structures considered homologous, that is look-alike, cannot be traced back to homologous cells or regions in the early stages of embryogenesis. In other words, homologous structures are arrived at by different routes. In other words, homologous body parts have absolutely nothing to do with evolution. Sir Gavin de Beer, as quoted by Denton, says this: correspondence between homologous structures cannot be pressed back to similarity of position of the cells of the embryo or the parts of the egg out of which these structures are ultimately differentiated. Embryonic homology does not indicate evolution. In fact, you could say that there is no embryonic homology. Well, ultimately, and again, Sir Gavin de Beer asked this: genetically, if these parts come from common ancestors, they should be controlled by the same genes. If these homologous body parts all come from a common ancestor, and if they were derived by heredity, what did we say the molecule of heredity was? DNA, the genetic material. All these homologous body parts should show genetic homology. They have to come from the same area. They have to come from the same genes. Is that what we find? The answer is absolutely not. Different kinds of animals, the look-alike homologous body parts, almost always come from different genes. This right here settles the whole issue of whether or not homology has anything to do with evolution. The conclusion is absolutely not. Well, how do you explain homology. Well, remember what we said? The other theory was that it was a design by an intelligent designer. And what it's doing is showing just a variation on a theme. If I had an intelligent designer and he had a good design, he would just change that theme to suit the specific purpose that he had. In man, he'd make it work best for a man. In a porpoise, he'd make it work best for a porpoise. In a bat, he'd make it work best for a bat. If that was the single best design, why go to a less functional design? If you were a good engineer, isn't that what you would do? Isn't that exactly what they did out in San Francisco? That bridge is no longer there in its entirety, but I've always used this slide, so I'm going to keep using it. This is the Bay Bridge, or what it once looked like. Some people argue whether or not it was good design. But look at the similarity in design. I'm sorry, that's the Bay Bridge. Look at the similarity in design to the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, which bridge evolved from the other? Or is it just a variation on a theme by an intelligent engineer, by an intelligent creator? What makes more sense? Bay Bridge, Golden Gate Bridge. That's good engineering. That shows intelligence. All that engineer did, all those engineers did, was take a theme and vary it for their particular purposes. That's evidence of design. That's evidence of intelligence. That's evidence of what? Plan and purpose. Evidence of an intelligent designer. You don't have to do that with engineering. You can do the same thing with artwork. Let's say you have a theme of musicians. You can make beautiful artwork of musicians. You can vary your theme and make ugly artwork of musicians. You see, variation on a theme is nothing new. It's just very offensive to the evolutionist. Now, I'd like to show you another area that we'd like to look at. This is one of my favorite areas. Let me just sum up homology real quick. Serial homology doesn't work unless arms evolve from legs, right? If you can get arms from legs, or if arms did evolve from legs, I can believe in homology. Embryonic homology, genetic homology doesn't exist. And that strongly speaks against evolution. But homology does seem to indicate an intelligent designer. In fact, it strongly indicates variation on a theme by an intelligent designer. And picking up with that same theme, the fits like a glove phenomena, harmony, I call it engineering. If you go out into the living world and you find examples of excellent engineering, what would you think? Would you think that there was an intelligent designer, an intelligent creator, an intelligent engineer? What if that engineering was absolutely outstanding? You would almost be compelled to think that there was an intelligent engineer, especially in living things. And that's one area that's really fascinated me. How would you recognize good engineering? Well, if you're going to engineer something extremely well, something that's well engineered, uses the least amount of materials, put together with the least amount of effort to do the most amount of work, utilizing the least amount of energy. That's called efficiency. That's what good engineering would entail. Things would work just as well as they possibly could. In fact, the perfect machine, the ideal machine, would do everything immediately and require no energy at all. True? And that's contrasted to a teenager who does nothing, always, and spends all your money. But the ideal machine would do all of these things. It would show perfect engineering. It would look just perfect. It would require almost nothing to keep it going. When we go out to the biological world, what do we find? Do we find examples of good engineering or wasteful engineering? Well, let's see. Back around the turn of the century, when they started building large, steel-hulled, ocean-going ships, one of the first ships they built was a ship called the Great Eastern. It was a giant ship, massive. It had a screw propeller, it had a paddle wheel, and it had sails. 3 forms of energy. And guess what? It was so inefficient that it went broke. They couldn't make any money. It required too much energy. The engineers went back to the drawing board. And after a lot of trial and error, they found out that if you're going to build an efficient ship, the width to length ratio has to fall somewhere between 0.21 and 0.30. And so they started building ships with a ratio between 0.21 and 0.30, width to length. And guess what they found? They were very efficient. They could make money. They moved through the water perfectly. somebody finally had the idea. They said, gee, I wonder what the fastest swimming fish in the ocean have as their ratio of length to width. Can you see? Dolphin has a ratio of 0.25, a whale of 0.21, the tuna 0.28, and the Greenland shark 0.26. How do they know? How do these fish know exactly how fat to get? You know, if you didn't know better, you would swear that there was an intelligent creator who created them just like this to be maximally efficient, to be maximally engineered. In fact, when you look at some of the fastest swimming fish, they've got an extra added ingredient that people didn't think about until, just a few years ago. When you look at certain fish that are exceptionally fast swimmers, they have a slime that coats the outside of their body, a real greasy, oily slime-type substance that cuts down their friction and their drag drastically. And for a while, people who sail, some of the competition sailors, were putting lubricant on the side of their boats, and it was such an unfair advantage that they made them stop it. You see, somebody went out there and engineered those fish for maximum efficiency. That's the only reasonable explanation. I don't think they're smart enough to do it. It took the engineers several attempts. It took them many years to get it right. Is that evidence of an intelligent creator, of a good engineer? That's evidence of a great engineer. Same thing occurred when they started building jet aircraft. Problem with jet aircraft, when they landed and they took off, the wings became very unstable, snapped off, plane crashed, people died. Folks were upset. And the engineers worked and worked, and they poured tons of money into this problem, trying to figure out the problem. And finally, one day, somebody said, well, listen, you know, if you look at a bird of prey, if you look at an eagle or a hawk or an owl, these things dive out of the air 50, 60, 70 miles an hour, land in the back of a running rabbit, take off again. They never crash. How do they do it? Are you ready for this? There's one single feather on the leading aspect, on the leading edge of these birds' wing, that when they dive and take off, that one feather lifts up so that air flows under that feather and eliminates the turbulence. You go from this to this. Now, people talk about having a bird brain, but that looks pretty smart to me. Now, when those aircraft engineers realized that that's how that bird did it, you know what they did? They did what any good engineer would do. They stole somebody else's design. That's exactly how they've solved that problem now in aircraft. Now, is that evidence of a good designer, of a great engineer? That's something that even our engineers took years and years and years to develop. And the information that I just presented from that comes from a book written by a couple of New Agers. Excuse me. I'm not sure about the pronunciation. I say Agros and Stanciu. But their book, The New Biology, and I'll just warn you about this, it is written from a New Age perspective. They are evolutionists, even though these gentlemen come to the conclusion in their book that if you look at nature, there must be an engineer, and as they put it, there must be an engineer. The engineer is an artist, they go on to say, because of the beauty in nature, and they say that the artist and engineer is God with a capital G. You see, they know that there must be a God. The atheistic humanistic evolutionist is starting to look around him and say, wait a minute, it's too good. It's much better than I can do. Therefore, there must be a God, but they're missing the historic God. They're missing that man in point-time history. They're missing Jesus Christ. But and again, I would recommend this book as long as you understand what perspective they're coming from, but they have some fascinating stories in it. Just to show you what happens when man tries to duplicate God's engineering feats. Your heart's incredible. Our heart isn't. When man tried to build an artificial heart, it only cost $7 million. It required an extra 375-pound air compressor with a separate power supply, and it couldn't adjust to simple events like standing up and sitting down. You know, it's just like Carly Simon says, nobody does it better. You don't put a lot of maintenance into your heart. You don't change the oil. Sometimes you have to change the valves and the pipes. But it works pretty well for most of us for around 60 to 70 years. Man just does not engineer things as well as God does. In fact, there's a whole new branch of science that was discussed in the Smithsonian Magazine, I think it was in July, in which now scientists are starting to look at the biological world and they're starting to realize that the solution to many of their engineering problems is right there in the biological world. Isn't it amazing what dumb random chance can do over billions of years? These people are looking at this design that's able to accomplish and solve the problems that brilliant scientists have been unable to solve for years, and yet they're still unable to say that there is a God, that there is a designer, that there is a creator. And you know, that's exactly what Romans chapter 1 talks about. Romans chapter 1, around verse 20, says that there's so much evidence for God that these people are without excuse. And yet some of them are coming up with the idea, with the correct answer, that there must be a God. They've just missed who it is. Let me just finish up with natural selection. Natural selection, according to Darwin, went something like this. That you had all these animals that were competing with each other, sort of like dog-eat-dog world. There was too little food, too many predators, too much severe weather, too much disease. You'd get a struggle for survival of the fittest, that animals would be constantly changing because of the environment. The environment would make these animals change, and that you'd constantly be getting new and different types of animals, new critters all the time. And the problem with Darwin's idea about natural selection is that it's just not what we see. When you start talking to the experts and start reading what they wrote, this is what you find out. This is from Wines and Rottenberry. Coexisting species appear to use resources more or less opportunistically. We find little evidence that competition in the past has led to an orderly community struggle. From P.S. Messenger, I love this. Actual competition is difficult to see in nature. Boy, that flies in the face of what Charles Darwin wrote. Instances of direct mutual harm between species are not known to us. This group of researchers, headed by Ali. More observations, and this is how Argos and Stanciu sum up. It does not square with observation. What you see is not what Darwin described. What is really out there, what you can observe, does not agree with Darwin. Quote, it does not square with observation. Ruthless struggle between species can be induced artificially in the laboratory, but it is difficult to point out clear examples of mutual harm between natural species undisturbed by man. Well, what is natural selection all about? When you start looking at natural selection, let me say this first and foremost. Natural selection is not an evolutionist's idea. Charles Darwin wrote about natural selection, but he stole the idea from a Christian creationist by the name of Edward Blyth. And what Edward Blyth said is that natural selection works, or was what God used, so that after the flood, you would get animals to migrate and fill every different ecological niche. And I can tell you better by an example. He said that if you just put two types of rabbits, or just two rabbits on the ark, but that they had all the genetic information, so that when they had their first litter, when they had their first group of little bunnies, they produced a whole variety of bunnies. White bunnies, brown bunnies, big-eared bunnies, little-eared bunnies, furry bunnies. If you were able to put enough genetic information in just those two rabbits to produce a whole variety, what would happen is that the light-colored rabbits, the white rabbits that migrated to Alaska would survive. The brown rabbits that migrated to Alaska would stick out and get eaten. The brown rabbits that migrated to Louisiana would survive. They would breed and produce another generation. And when brown rabbits breed with brown rabbits, they produce, for the most part, brown rabbits. The white rabbits that went down to South Louisiana got eaten by the Cajuns. So that you see, that's how natural selection works. That's what Edward Blyth said. Charles Darwin read that, and he tried to apply that to evolution. But here's the problem. You start with rabbits, and you end up with what? Rabbits. You don't start with rabbits and end up with dogs. You don't start with rabbits and end up with cats. You always end up with rabbits. And that's what evolutionists are just starting to understand about natural selection. You can't select what you don't have. You see what I'm saying? If you're going to make a selection, you have to have something to select. Natural selection only works when you already have the existing genetic information. And you know what? If I was an intelligent creator, if I was going to be a good engineer, isn't that exactly what I'd do? If you were going out on a hiking trip, would you take a knife, a screwdriver, a toothpick, a pair of tweezers, a pair of pliers? Would you take all those things, or would you take one Swiss Army knife? You take one Swiss Army knife, because in that one thing you have all the variation, all the genetic variability to get a whole variety that would fit in different areas around the world. A good engineer would design his system so that these living organisms would reproduce a wide variety that would find themselves in some type of ecological area that was perfectly suited for them. That was just perfectly suited. The white rabbit in the snow, the brown rabbit in the swamp, the camel in the desert. That's exactly what you would expect from an intelligent creator who knew exactly what he needed. He would put all the variety that he needed in that one type. And that is exactly what we see. Natural selection works with an organism's ability to change within its genetic limits so that plants and animals can multiply, fill every possible area of the earth with variation on a theme perfectly suited for that area. That's the best example for natural selection. That is the best description of what actually occurs in natural selection. When I look around me, when I look at design, I see evidence not of time, natural processes, and random chance. I see evidence of a brilliant engineer who's also an artist who knew exactly what he was doing and put the solution, the engineering solution to all the problems that we would face right there in his creation. When I look at living organisms, I see evidence of a master watch builder, a master engineer. I see definite positive evidence of information, of intelligence, of a creator God. So that when you look there and you see it, I agree exactly with what Paul said when he said anybody who looks at it and fails to acknowledge it, because I know they see it, but if you fail to acknowledge it, then you're without excuse. The evidence for God, the evidence for an intelligent creator is completely overwhelming. It's out there, we just have to look and appreciate it. Thank you.